Hello and welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. This is a podcast to help you find peace with food and to overcome disordered eating. And I'm Harriet Frew, aka the Eating Disorder Therapist. I'm really excited to share with you all kinds of stories, tips, information and guest interviews to help you on your journey in finding peace with food. So thank you so much for listening today. Now today I have another guest on the show and I have my first male guest, which is really about time. I have 25-year-old Christophe from Louisiana in the USA. So Christophe works for Apple in Austin and he's always been interested in health alongside many other interests, including psychology, philosophy, history and spending time in nature. Now, I met Christophe through Instagram and his account is at Metabolism_recovery if you want to go and check it out. Through this account, he shares his wisdom and understanding of the powerful impact of extreme dieting on the body, gleaned from his own research and also his personal experience of bulimia nervosa recovery. So I'm really excited to be speaking to him today and hearing a male perspective on eating disorders. So let's get to the interview. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Christophe. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today.
I'm glad to be on.
Okay, brilliant. So, Christophe, could you tell us a bit more about who you are and what you do?
So I'm a guy in my mid-20s, and, I've always been really interested in health from a young age, but also have a lot of other interests, including, philosophy, like psychology, history. And I think a lot of those other interests kind of have had an influence on some of the ideas that have developed around health that I'm sure we're going to talk about. And so I currently live in Austin, Texas, and I work for Apple as an analyst.
Okay, brilliant. So, Christophe, one of the reasons that I invited you on today is obviously you've had your own journey and kind of overcoming issues with food and body image. So I'd be really grateful if you could just tell us a bit more about that journey, please.
Yeah, sure. So I guess my journey, this health journey, kind of began my senior year in high school. So growing up, I was always really big into sports and I didn't have much free time. And this was the first time in my life where I had lots of free time to do all the stuff I wanted to do, hang out with friends. And I got really big into self-improvement at this time. And part of that involved going after health and fitness goals. And a lot of my friends were also really big into that as well. So we would go to the gym almost every day and track our calories on MyFitnessPal. But it wasn't anything really an issue at the time, but we decided that we were going to go on a diet for our senior trip that we had planned for the beach in a few months. And so we got a dieting program online, and overnight I was eating probably around 3,500 calories and we didn't need to lose weight at all. We're all athletes and really in good shape, but we kind of saw it as something cool to do and interesting to do. And so I guess the first time I kind of started noticing some issues with food is a few months into my diet. A friend and I were sitting in his kitchen and he started mentioning to me that he was having these peanuts and he could not stop thinking about peanuts. And I remember us both kind of laughing about it because I was experiencing the exact same thing. And, I guess we probably should have seen that as a sign that we were probably taking a little bit overboard, especially at 18. But we kind of saw that as a good sign that we were headed in the right direction, trying to go after our goals. But yeah, so that was the first time I kind of noticed, that was my first experience with cravings that are slightly different than just hunger in general. A few months later, we finally arrived at the beach. And this is when my real struggle with food started to kind of develop. So most of my friends had quit the diet at this point, but I decided I was going to stick with it because I had another beach trip coming up. But yeah, and then I started developing some more intense reaction to food. So some of my friends were going to a Waffle House one day while we were there. And I don't know if people in the UK know, but Waffle House in the US. So I went along with him and I kind of rationalized that I'm just going there to hang out with him, but I wasn't planning on eating. I was just kind of planning on being there just around the food. And it yeah, so looking back, I kind of know that whenever you're in this diet mode, your body kind of changes your behaviors in ways to where you're more likely to be around food and more likely to end up accessing food. And I kind of had this drive where I kind of wanted to be around food more than normal. And it was kind of like an odd experiencing that. But yeah, I can still remember that after we were finished eating, we were all talking. I could not stop focusing on one of my friends still had food on his plate. And he had like 2 eggs and some toast. And I remember feeling, is he going to eat that? Is he going to let that go to waste? And, when the waitress finally came and took away the food, I remember feeling kind of devastated about it. And it was kind of like a feeling I never really had in the past. But so this continued on until while all my friends were at the beach, I found myself in the condo looking inside of the fridge at all the food that was there. And I was so tempted to just binge. And, I fought it for a little while. And then before I knew it, I was eating like 4 bowls of spaghetti. And, I could have ate a lot more actually, but I just didn't want to eat everyone's food. But that was my first binge, I would say. And I was confused more than anything because that was the first time in my life where I felt like I knew what I wanted to do, or knew what I felt like I had no control over my actions. And so I guess at that moment, I had 2 options. So option one would be to quit the diet and start eating regularly, or option 2 would be to go back on the diet and make sure that it doesn't happen again, that I don't cheat again. And, looking back, I would obviously, if I can go back and tell myself, I would just say, you can just quit the diet. And before you know it, food will be a lot better. And you'll be able to have like a more normal experience again. But, the way society views like perseverance and determination made that choice kind of not an obvious one. And I thought for sure that the right thing to do would be to go back on the diet and to this time, make sure that I didn't fail again. And so that I didn't know it at the time, but that's definitely when my eating disorder first began, for sure. But but for the rest of the summer, even though I had a battle going on with food, I still was very happy. So I've always been a really happy person. I was actually still really excited at this time because I figured that all I had to do was figure out the perfect diet or the perfect way of eating that would allow me to get rid of these cravings and still stay lean. And I've always been very experimental, so this kind of got me into trouble trying different things. I did a lot of fasting during this time. Also a lot of cheat meals. So I'd kind of alternate between fasting and then these big cheat meals, which were really more like binges disguised as cheat meals. And so I ended up having my second binge about 2 months after my initial binge. And, it just gets more and more frequent after that because the more you fail at a diet, it becomes harder for you to stick to it and to go back on it after you. So it's pretty common that people start off with like less frequent binges and it just becomes more and more frequent. And for me, it got to the point where around 3 months in, I was binging at least or almost every day. And if I wasn't binging, I was restricting. And that's when I was at probably my worst in my eating disorder. And, I was well into college at that point, and I had definitely skipped more classes than I had actually been to. And I was really non-social. I really did not want to socialize. And that's kind of when I started looking for kind of a way. That's when I started to turn to purging. And it actually, so like after I started developing this, like I had bulimia after that point for probably another 3 years. And I really, for a while there, I thought I was not going to ever stop because I was like comfortable with what I was doing. It became just like a habit, a pattern. So yeah, I knew it was going to take something pretty big for me to change that.
Sure. Well, thank you, for sharing your story there, because I think it's so common as well, isn't it? That I think it often perhaps can start with what we term as quite perhaps an innocent diet, really, like not even knowing the kind of road that we could be going down here. And like you said, like initially when you had that first binge, in a way you didn't even really perhaps understandably like relate it to the dieting. It was just all a bit confusing really. And then you just thought, well, I just need to kind of diet better. I need to find the right meal plan to avoid this happening. But I guess it's quite a slippery slope, isn't it, really? Because of it's almost, yeah, you keep trying different meal plans, you become more restrictive. And like you said, in a way that the binges become more frequent, and then eventually you're kind of into purging as well. So, Christophe, was there like a real turning point for you in overcoming these issues?
Yes, yeah, definitely. And then, yeah, plus it's exactly what you just mentioned. That's definitely how it seems to be. And so, yeah, as far as the turning point, you get some people who just get kind of stuck in this cycle of restriction and binging, and they kind of have an idea that, yeah, eventually they'll stop. But then you kind of look back and, the days are long and the years are short. And before you know it, it's been 5 years and you've been in this battle with restriction and your eating disorder battle. And, anyone who has been on a similar journey of having an eating disorder, especially binging, that always have this moment after the binge where, the cravings are subsided for a while and you kind of have a clear head. And it's so really common to make a promise to yourself that, okay, I'm never going to do that again. Mm-hmm. And I was definitely not an exception to this. I probably made that promise to myself hundreds of times through my time with the eating disorder. And it's very rare to actually keep that promise. And in fact, I never did. And, this that starts to have like an impact. You kind of lose your sense of, self-efficacy and feel like you lose control over your life. And, and I'd already been familiar with the idea of, metabolism recovery and the idea that you need to, if you start eating normally again, then you can help change some of the issues that result from dieting. But I never was completely sold on the idea just because it seemed like a kind of a risk to me. But I realized that all the time I had wasted with this battle with food and how consumed I was with it, that the risk became obvious that it's better than the route I was going down. So I basically started changing my promise from I'm never going to binge again to I'm never going to restrict again. And, this definitely wasn't overnight where I was able to do this, but it was more of just I slowly started changing my thinking about disorder. And, I started asking different questions like, why is it that I see my survival instincts as the enemy? Like, why would it be that I have like such a bad relationship with the very part of me that's meant to keep me alive? And like, why is it that I can't have a good relationship with that?
Sure. So it sounds like there as well, like there was something that shifted, wasn't there, where you started to really perhaps just think about maybe I can trust my body again, or kind of like, whereas I guess when we're dieting, we're just ignoring those signals, aren't we? But there was something that shifted for you. And like you said, in a way, you started asking yourself those questions really and having a bit more body trust there. So how did you kind of, what were the factors that really kind of helped you start to turn all of this around?
Yeah, I would say a big one that finally helped me have trust in like the process of, refeeding and allowing myself to eat the food that it wanted me to was reading The Biology of Human Starvation, which is a pretty big 2-volume book that it does starvation experiment, which was a experiment in the 1950s where they took 36 young men, and they were all healthy, and they put them on a restricted diet for 6 months. And then they basically looked at their reaction to the diet, whether it be just health metrics, but then also, their behaviors and thoughts that resulted from the restriction. And what was really eye-opening to me is that these men had to dieting because it was very similar to all of the thoughts and behaviors that I had been experiencing for the past 5 years or so at that point. And so just some of the examples, so almost all the men became obsessed with food, and they were completely just focused on it. In fact, I believe it was 3 of the men actually became chefs after the experiment because they were so interested in because of their state they're in. And I kind of had similar, like when I was in my disorder, I would spend lots of time in grocery stores. Like looking back, it's like behaviors that seem very odd, but you're just driven to be more interested in food. And also like one man reported that, when he's watching movies, he was only really interested in the scenes where they had food. And he had my experience with that because when I had my eating disorder, I would love watching like the Food Network and eating challenges. Like there's a show Man versus Food where he would eat as much food as he could. And that was just something where like, and it's interesting looking back because I'm not interested in any of that anymore. And I wasn't interested in those type of shows before my eating disorder. So it's kind of odd how like, the brain can just make that shift. But yeah, I think those were like the two big interesting things that I noticed about the experiment. And it kind of showed me that like all it takes is like you can take a healthy group of young men and just by restricting them, you can give them all the same symptoms and behaviors that we see in eating disorders.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating study, isn't it, actually? And I could just think of so many people I've worked with actually who have ended up working in bakeries or cafes or spend like loads of time like cooking for others. And it's just such a natural thing, isn't it? I think when you're starved of food that you just want to be around it, even if you're not going to eat it, you want to be kind of smelling it, looking at it, yeah. It's such a kind of common thing. And I guess it just shows just that powerful instinct, doesn't it, for survival, really? Yeah, really interesting. So reflecting on the journey you've been on as well, what are your key learnings about the impact of dieting on your relationship with food and body image?
Yeah, so like for a while I was in my restriction and my eating disorder phase, I really kind of thought that eating disorders were always this simply like an emotional issue, kind of like depression, anxiety. And in fact, that's what you kind of, anytime like you look up like what causes binge eating or what causes eating disorders, it like you almost always see articles that explain it in this way and kind of leave out the whole food aspect of it. And but looking back at the Minnesota starvation experiment, like I mentioned, it kind of showed to me that, it's sometimes a lot simpler than that, to where it's just our body's reaction to dieting, and all of that kind of makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. But also, like, the men in the starvation experiment, they didn't have all like the same cultural pressures that we have today that are often like blamed on developing eating disorders. And well, I definitely think that it's important to that cultural in that they make us more likely to diet in the first place and make it harder for us to stop. It's definitely not the only thing that, kind of leads to the eating disorder. And, I used to view my eating disorder as the cravings and the binging themselves as opposed to the restriction. But now I've kind of changed that, and I kind of just see the cravings and binging as a inevitable result of the prolonged restriction that I was trying to stay in. And I think there's from my like experience with therapy, I think, mainstream kind of still sees the binging and the cravings as the main issue, whenever the main issue is really the inability to give up the restriction, even though you see that it's causing you issues. Like when I was in therapy, we would also always, work on ways to prevent, like when we started our discussion, it was always like, did you binge this week? And if you did, then like, what can we do to prevent it in the future? When we probably should have been looking for ways to prevent the restriction. And that's why I think it's good, to have a therapist who kind of is knowledgeable about some of these biological concepts in like starvation. And the idea that eating disorders always have this deep emotional root cause to them is actually kind of an attractive idea to people that are in restriction, because it gives them this false sense of hope that there's a way that they can still restrict and get an eating disorder if only they can find this one issue that led to their eating disorder. And no one really wants to hear that they'll have to gain weight to get rid of their cravings, but myself and many others have found that their, so-called emotional eating has gone away when they stop dieting. And that kind of shows to me that it's not all just emotions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it just shows, doesn't it? Because I think you can't ignore that part of treatment, can you? Like, you have to treat the restriction really to be able to develop a healthy relationship with food. Like, you can't, as we know from the Minnesota starvation study, you can't stop being preoccupied with food. You can't stop having big cravings. You can't stop wanting to binge if you're in a place of restriction. That's just kind of like a biological thing that's going to happen, isn't it? Did you find then, Christophe, with you then as well? Because I think I'm really with you that I believe that the restriction bit needs to be addressed first. But obviously then some people, when they have managed the restriction and they are eating more, they may still continue to binge. And I think part of that is because they are still mentally restricting. They're not truly allowing themselves the full range of foods. So binge is still being triggered. But did you find that once you were kind of fully in that place where you knew that you were kind of, biologically feeding yourself enough, did you find that you didn't have any binges at all that could be triggered by emotional things?
I would say if it wasn't have stuff that triggered binges, but I would have stuff that would try to like change my thinking to where I would think, oh, maybe I should go back to restriction. And yeah, that was something I definitely had to fight from the beginning. But I mean, I would say anytime you have, I would say like that was pretty much the case for me.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Okay. No, sure. I think it's just really helpful and really interesting, isn't it? I just think it just shows, sometimes how just the power of restriction, but not just the kind of under eating of enough calories for your body to function. But I think as well, people often get stuck in a kind of mental restriction. So even if they're allowing themselves more food, there's that constant judgment around what they're eating, which can then maybe sometimes lead to binging as well because of I've blown it thinking, that kind of thing. But no, really interesting to hear your experience. So what are your thoughts as well about on the impact of childhood and trigger events and how this can impact your relationship with food, if at all?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting question, because I feel like my childhood was always really good. I had a really good childhood. And, I think it's always a good idea to look back on your past and see how some of those behaviors or some of those experiences can affect a lot of your thoughts and actions today. But, a big part of my work is revolved around, demystifying eating disorders. And like, a lot of our thoughts and behaviors that we have with eating disorders make perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. And a lot of what's considered like disorder is actually our body doing exactly what it should be given in those circumstances. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a good idea to still look back in your past in general, but I don't think that, I mean, you do that instead of ending the restriction, because I would still say that being out of restriction is the most important part, because even if you do find this one event that really changed your childhood, it would help to discover it, but it's not necessarily going to get you right out of restriction. You're still going to have to do the work to get your body into like the state that it needs to be and get to a healthy weight. And then finally a lot of those survival instincts will subside.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think really interesting. I mean, do you think as well, I think something that I kind of feel sometimes about perhaps people that have, experienced more trauma or they have had things that have been really difficult, I think as well, maybe, because I think anyone that diets and restricts is vulnerable to these symptoms. We kind of know that, don't we, from the research. But I think as well that, maybe if one has had experiences where you've experienced, I don't know, some sort of abuse or trauma or like criticism or judgment, I think as well, putting that onto the dieting, if you're kind of parenting yourself then, perhaps quite unconsciously in a very critical way, you may be more vulnerable to kind of using, or, one could be more vulnerable to using dieting in a very kind of punishing way. Whereas maybe if one has like a healthier self-esteem and has kind of slipped into dieting, it may be a bit easier to get out of it again.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that.
Sure. Yeah, they're really interesting, but really exciting, Christophe, as well. You know, you've written a book, haven't you? So can you tell us a bit more about this?
Yeah, well, if anyone would have told me in high school that I would end up writing a book, I probably would have thought they were crazy. I once heard this quote, only write a book if you can't not write it. And I think that kind of sums up why I ended up writing a book. Living with an eating disorder for so long, I felt a lot of the mainstream advice just wasn't consistent with what I experienced and what a lot of other individuals have experienced. So I just kind of wanted to share my story and some of the information that allowed me to finally recover and convinced me to finally recover. And I was kind of reluctant to write it at first just because a lot of the information and the stories are pretty personal, but I decided that, if it can help somebody out, then I should share it.
Well, I think it's fantastic. And Christophe, what's the name of your book if people want to go and look that up?
Yeah, it's just Metabolism Recovery is the name of the book. And if you type in, I think you search Christophe Garon on Amazon, you'll find it. Or you can just go through my site, metabolismrecovery.com.
Sure. Okay, brilliant. So how did you find that kind of whole process of writing the book?
It was pretty a challenge because I worked full time and I was kind of just writing it as I go. But, I really like writing in general just because it helps, organize. I started writing a lot of the content that ended up in the book. A lot of it started with me just writing for Metabolism Recovery. My website was just started blogging about some of the ideas that we've kind of discussed today so far. But, aside from Metabolism Recovery, I like writing about, I have another website where I like to write stuff that's not related to the metabolism. And for instance, I write about like the physics of weightlifting or just random topics like that. And I've always found that, writing has kind of helped organize my ideas.
Sure. Well, fantastic. I think, good on you for writing a book, because I think it's something that a lot of us kind of think about, but actually kind of getting around to doing it, really impressive. And I'm sure a lot of people that are listening to this actually would just find it really, really helpful to read about your experiences. So, Christophe, how do you work to find a healthy balance with food and exercise in your life today?
Well, first I will say that, the main difference between me and my relation to food and exercise now, as opposed to when I was in eating disorder, is now they're more of like an afterthought, where before it was just the center stage of my life. It was like the main thing I focused on. I would say when it comes to exercise, mainly have switched my focus appearance more to performance and what I can do with my body as opposed to how it looks. And so what that kind of looks like is, instead of doing like going on runs like every day and forcing myself to do that, I'll do activities in general that are just like a variety of stuff. I'll go on hikes with friends. I'll go for a run some days. I'll go swimming sometimes. And so I like to just kind of keep things interesting and basically just make it exciting. And I'm more likely to end up being active this way anyway, because I'm just more excited about it. But food, was always a bigger issue than me than exercise. And because like food basically just consumed my life for 5 years. So now I'm kind of at the point where I really just don't want food to control my life anymore and have that power over me. But a big part of that is just that I'm at a healthy weight. So I'm naturally less interested in food. But I also have, made a conscious decision that I'm not going to go down past that end up leading to me developing those cravings. But I get emails from people all the time. And like one of the main things they ask me is they want kind of verification that after they start eating to satiety and eating normally again, that those cravings are going to go away. And a lot of people have a hard time trusting that they will. And I definitely had a hard time trusting that those cravings would go away. But I would say a good rule of thumb is that if your weight is in balance, then your appetite will follow that healthy weight, and your body won't have the need to give you those intense cravings of food and make you obsess about food. And so now I just basically eat when I'm hungry and get on to things that I'm just more excited about.
Sure. It's kind of like taking the leap, isn't it, with that sort of self-trust, really? Because I think, isn't it, after you've been dieting for so long, you've just like lost that self-trust and like being able to rely on those internal signals. But it's kind of like, I always think as well, it's kind of almost like the only way out is through, isn't it? You kind of got to just kind of take that leap, and it might be a bit bumpy to start with, but it's the kind of way to get there. So, Christophe, what do you think we can do? Big question here, really, but to support young people growing up to have a better relationship with food and their bodies?
Yeah, this is actually a really difficult question, but I think I'd have a slightly different view on it than some people will. Idea out there that we should, eliminate all ideas or all ideals of like the ideal body from culture and social media and advertising. And I just kind of wonder how realistic that would be, because I think as humans, we always have this ideal that we desire, whether it be, finances, success, or in this case, like with our bodies. And you kind of see that sometimes that people switch skill to the next, and kind of see that in the body positivity space. Sometimes people who have lost weight, I don't think that's the route to go on either. But, I think instead an ideal that ideals that young people can aspire to. And I think for the most part, like movies in the past decade or so have done a good job with that. But I prefer to visual level because we have more, it's more actionable for us. So all of us have some young people in our lives that we have a chance to influence positively. And, as individuals, we can't help everyone, but I think if we all kind of make an attempt to have a positive impact on those young people, then it can really change our lives. But I would say, as far as influencing in general, I did force young people to be something they're not, for sure. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't hold them to a high expectation either. I think it's important to, help them or let them decide what their ideal is, and then encourage them to be the best they can be at it. And I think this last part's important because that kind of helps build confidence in their identity and who they are. And it'll make them less likely to be influenced by, like, they'll already be on their path and be confident and more confident in who they are. And I would say this confidence would kind of bleeds over in all areas of life, including relationship with food as well as body image.
Yeah, and I think it's so true, isn't it? Because I think if one has got like a healthy self-esteem and is developing confidence, in a way, you're much less likely to get kind of diverted down a destructive route, aren't you? Because you're going to be like rooted maybe in kind of values and interests that are inspiring you and are kind of positive and uplifting and probably taking you in quite a constructive direction. Whereas if your self-esteem is low, in our culture, you can be more vulnerable to being influenced by some of those negative messages and kind of investing a lot of energy in that. So I think you're really right there. Self-esteem is the key, isn't it? I think trying to support people to be themselves and follow their own path and all that good stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
So, Christophe, final quick fire questions for you. What would be your last supper 3-course meal?
Let's see. Well, I'd start off with a big green salad with lots of veggies, probably some blue cheese. And then for my main course, I'd get a giant grilled ribeye with some rosemary and garlic and maybe some pasta on the side. Mm-hmm. And then I'd probably finish it off with some cheesecake.
Yeah, sounds delicious. And do you have a favorite quote or mantra?
Yeah, so I'm really big into stoicism, and one idea, a mantra that has roots in stoicism is basically Latin for remember death. And it sounds pretty dark, but I think it's actually a positive quote because it helps you kind of appreciate life as we have it and to make sure we're just living life to the fullest. So that's something I always try to think about.
Sure. And tell us something about you that may surprise us.
Okay, well, I can write with both hands, And so I was born left-handed, but just one day in 8th grade, I decided to start writing with my right hand. And I was horrible at it, but I just kind of stuck with it. And so now I just write with both hands. But funny short story about that is in college, I was taking a big university exam, and I had an essay that I had to write on the back of it. And I was writing and my hand started cramping up. So I switched from my left hand to my right hand. And then I turned it in. And then the next day, the professor called me or sent me an email or said he wanted to see me after class. And I think he suspected I was cheating. So I had to show him that I could write with both hands and I wasn't, in fact, cheating. So
Oh, wow. No, quite a unique skill, though, isn't it? I don't think there's many people that could actually write to the exam standard with both hands. So, Christophe, as well, can you just remind us where can people find you? If they want to check you out on social media or your website?
Yeah, so my website is metabolismrecovery.com, and also have Instagram where I share. I haven't been as active on Instagram as I like because I've been preparing for grad school soon, but also on Metabolism_recovery on Instagram. Those are the two main places where I add some content.
Okay, brilliant. Well, that's great. And I'll make sure that all that info is in the show notes so people can go and find you if they want to kind of follow up and ask any questions or anything. And of course, I'll put your book as well in the show notes because I think that would be really interesting for people. So, Christophe, thank you so much for coming on today. I really appreciate you, just sharing your story so openly and for, passing on this kind of wisdom and all the things that you've kind of learned on your journey. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks. It was great to be on it. I've interacted a lot on Instagram, so it's finally good to have been able to have a discussion with you.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, thanks, Christophe. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
So I hope you enjoyed this interview just as much as I did, and do go and check out Christophe's details in the show notes. Now, if you're not following me already, do seek me out on Instagram at The Eating Disorder Therapist. And for regular blogs to your inbox, do sign up for my weekly articles at rethinkyourbody.co.uk. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.